Hello, and welcome to the second lecture in a series of lectures on the integumentary system, the skin. The last lecture, session 1, we covered the cells and the structure of the epidermis. And in this lecture, I'm going to cover the dermis, hair, and glands that are found in the skin. So we'll begin, once again, we'll look at this image. We've been looking at it a lot of the skin. And so in the last lecture, we had covered this structure here, the epidermis. And in this lecture, as I said, we're going to talk about this underlying structure, which is the dermis. And we'll be looking at a number of structures, including how it's put together, the various different regions, the papillary region, the reticular region. We'll talk about how those are different from one another. We'll notice that there's these corpuscles of touch that we see in these epidermal ridges here. And we'll also talk about the hair as a structure and glands that we find in this part of the skin. So that's where we're going with that. Let's go ahead and begin then our notes. And we will start off with the heading, the dermis. So we're looking at the dermis. We can say that the dermis is composed of connective tissue, plus collagen fibers, and obviously collagen fibers are part of connective tissue. But we are getting additional bundles of fibers, elastic fibers, and what these two fibers, the addition of bundles of these two fibers, give us. So let's see how we're going to put this over here, I guess. So what those two provide is tensile strength, and the ability to stretch, and then recoil, all of which are important characteristics if you want healthy skin. So we also find, of course, fibroblasts, macrophages, and adipocytes in the dermis. The thickness of the dermis is going to vary depending on where you are in the body. So the thickest areas are in the palms and in the soles of the feet. So both of those correspond to the thickest areas of the epidermis too. So both of those areas contain very, very thick skin in terms of both the epidermis and the dermis itself. Also, the posterior aspect of the body and here we're talking in particular between the shoulder blades. Number 4, the lateral and medial sides of the limbs. And that, of course, includes both the arms and the legs. Both of those are included as limbs. Okay, that's the thickest region of the dermis. In addition to the collagen fibers and the other structures that we mentioned, the elastic fibers, we also find blood vessels, nerves, glands, hair, follicles in particular, and we'll define what that is in just a bit, are also found in the dermis. When we look at the dermis, we can divide it into two regions. And let me quickly just draw a little picture here. Try to capture what I'm talking about in that picture. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use this color to indicate so this is the epidermis. So this is my epidermis. And then this region here, and yeah, let's do it this way. Here, and approximately here. That region there is going to be the papillary region. And then this is the reticular region. And these two together make up the dermis. So basically, if we were to extend the line somewhere in that region, this region here, that's going to be our papillary region, and the rest of it, most of it, is the reticular region. So the dermis is composed of two regions. These are the papillary region and the reticular region. And we're going to focus first on the papillary region, describe a little bit about what's going on there, and then we'll focus on the reticular region. So let's begin, as I said, with the papillary region. So the papillary region, this is the superficial one-fifth of the dermis. So the top one-fifth of the dermis approximately is referred to as the papillary region. It is composed of areolar connective tissue, there are dermal papillae, and let's just for a moment come back to our drawing and identify what those are. So the dermal papillae are these hills. So this is my dermal papillae. It's this portion here. Let me go ahead and let me bring it up. So that's the dermal papillae. Okay. And if we come back to the more fancy drawing that the textbook offers us, we can look at those structures right there. So those are dermal papillae. Okay. All right. So these are the nipple shaped extensions of the papillary region. Okay. And what they do is they cause dents, or they indentation of the epidermis, which then produce the fingerprints that everybody is aware of. So as those ridges push up, they cause the epidermis to also ridge or produce ridge, and those series of or that pattern of ridge produces what we call fingerprints on the hand, fingers, and on the feet. Okay. Some dermal papillae contain these corpuscles of touch, also referred to as Meissner. Corpuscles. And these are going to be are areas that are sensitive to touch. Okay. So if we look at, let's come back to the drawing of the text or from the textbook, we can identify those areas. So these are different than the Merkel cells. So don't get these confused with Merkel cells. And here we go. There we go. All right. So here's my corpuscles of touch. And they're sitting inside that little indentation there, that little nipple-like structure. And, of course, they're connected to the nervous system. And we can see them here. As, again, this is not the same as the Merkel cells. So that's just another sensory modality that is built into the skin. So we have two areas where we're sensitive to touch. And we also have these free nerve endings. And since we're looking at this picture, we're going to talk about these so-called free nerve endings. Those are also, of course, connected to the nervous system. So let's go ahead back to our drawing. And we can insert those structures. So and let's just paint that baby green. Okay, and that is going to be my corpuscle of touch. And we also have free nerve endings. And let's see. I think I'm going to bring in red to do that. So, in fact, what I'm going to do here is create just one more of those nipples. And then, okay. And that's going to be our free nerve endings. Okay. right, let's do this. So we have that, and as I said, the free nerve endings. Within the dermal papillae. And these are going to produce hot. So this is where we feel hot and cold sensations on our skin, where we feel pain, we feel tickling and itching. These kinds of modalities are coming out of those free nerve endings. The deeper layer of the dermis, and this is going to be referred to as the reticular region. And here this is going to be composed of one dense, irregular connective tissue, and bundles of collagen fibers. So in addition to the typical dense, irregular connective tissue, we're also going to have bundles of collagen fibers to reinforce that tissue. We are also going to find some coarse elastic fibers. And we'll find nerves, oil glands, ducts of sweat glands, and some adipose tissue. We'll also find the hair follicles. Okay. So, very busy in this area. A lot of structures can be found there. And the composition of the connective tissue, the dense irregular connective tissue, plus the bundles of collagen fibers and some of these elastic fibers, are going to give you strength, extensibility, and elasticity. So the connective tissue produces strength, extensibility, the ability to stretch, and elasticity. All right. So, below the dermis is the subcutaneous layer. And this is composed of one areolar connective tissue, number 2, adipose tissue. Okay. As I mentioned before, the pattern of the dermal papillae on the fingers and on the in the hand and the bottom of the feet produces these structures that in the hand we call fingerprints. The technical term are epidermal ridges. Okay. So these are going to be produced around the 3rd to 4th fetal month of development. And they are the result of the dermal papillae and in the hand and in the foot. The idea is to increase surface area for grip. So increase surface area for the ability to grip well, either in for both the hand and the foot. The sweat glands that are going to empty onto the skin are actually going to empty onto the ridges. So sweat glands are going to open on the top of the ridges. And this is why we produce fingerprints, is because of that fact. And finally, the pattern of these epidermal ridges is genetically determined. So that is why we can use these in solving crime. Okay, so that really completes our discussion of the skin, epidermis, and the dermis. I want to now step back and talk a little bit about the physiology. I had promised this earlier. We're going to look at those functions more closely and provide a little more detail of each of the different functions. But before we do that, I would like to go ahead and one more time summarize by looking at the image from the textbook what we have covered so far. So, as you know, we've talked about the epidermis. We've now just finished a discussion on the dermis, which is divided into two regions, the papillary region and the reticular region. And in the reticular region, it's particularly busy because we have this pattern of nipple-like structures called the dermal papillae, which will eventually produce, and they don't show this on the picture, but it will produce ridges on the surface of the skin. That's what we're going to be calling fingerprints. We also find the hair follicle, which is this structure right here. Something I didn't mention, but is definitely there. We'll talk about this when we get into describing the hair. This is the erector pili muscle that's attached to hair. We also have these oil glands, the so-called sebaceous glands. And we have sweat glands, two different types of sweat glands. We'll describe the difference of those in just a bit. And we have the corpuscles of touch and the free nerve endings. So as well, of course, as the blood vessels that we find in this region. So all of that, a lot of complexity there, a lot of structures, and that's what we've covered so far. So let's talk about the physiology of the skin. And we're not going to go into too much detail here, but basically we're going to look at the functions and describe each of the functions in a little more detail than just making a list of those functions. So let's begin with the first one. At least on my list, it's regulation of body temperature. So this is done through two mechanisms: sweat, so the evaporation of water from the surface of our skin, which will carry away heat, and number two, changes in blood flow patterns. So we can direct blood closer to the surface of the skin and thereby dump heat. We can redirect that blood deeper into the skin and conserve heat. So both of those mechanisms are important for regulating body temperature. A second function is protection. And here what we're talking about is protection as a physical barrier. And here we talk about abrasions. We've already described what that is. The invasion of microbes. Dehydration. And protection from ultraviolet light, which can be damaging to genetic information. So it's a protective barrier for these types of problems. The skin is also available to take in information, sensory information. So let's talk about that. And that would be number 3 on our list. Sensory information. So things like temperature, touch, pressure, pain, and a number of other sensory modalities, all of which are important to give us information about what's going on in the world around us, and for us to be able to respond to changes in that environment. So all of this information can come in through the skin. A fourth function is excretion. And here, of course, what we're talking about is waste products. Such as ions and organic compounds. The skin does, in fact, in the sweat that we produce, within that fluid there are waste products which are being excreted to the surface of the skin. It's not the major way in which we can get rid of these waste products, but it is one way in which this happens, is through the excretion, through being contained in the sweat and the fluids that we put onto the surface of the skin. We've also talked about immunity. So we talked about cells that are able to intercept bacteria and microbes and then migrate to places in the body that are capable of recognizing that microbe and responding to it. So immunity is a big part, but also just the protection, as we mentioned earlier, preventing things from getting into the body. So, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because there's an entire chapter in the textbook devoted to this idea. So not specifically about the skin, but the skin is included, and you'll learn how the skin participates in that process that we call immunity. So number 6 is, and here's one that you may not have been familiar with or really have thought about very much, and that the skin is a blood reservoir, meaning it contains about 8 to 10% of your total blood volume. Okay. So about 8 or 10% of total blood volume is contained in vessels of the skin. And that's available to be pushed out into the body and to be used in other places. So during heavy exercise, flow will decrease and be diverted, and blood will be diverted, to the blood vessels of the muscles. It's kind of an interesting dance that takes place because initially, when you begin to exercise, some of the heat that you're producing is going to be released over the surface of the skin. So there might be an actually slight increase in blood being pumped into the skin as you exercise just to get rid of the additional heat. But if heavy exercise, and here we're talking about really, panting hard, running, perhaps swimming, and these kinds of very difficult heavy exercises, then actually what's going to happen is there's going to be a decrease in the flow of blood into the skin, and it's going to be diverted into the muscles that you're using during that exercise. Okay. A seventh function is the synthesis of vitamin D, and so this is actually a group of compounds, and the functional form of vitamin D is not really produced until what's being produced in the skin is taken to the liver, and there it's changed, goes through a metabolic pathway and is changed. But these are going to be activated. These compounds are going to be activated by ultraviolet light. So your skin is actually playing a balancing act between getting enough ultraviolet light so that these compounds, these organic compounds, can be converted or activated by the ultraviolet light and then sent to the liver to be finalized and changed into the active form of vitamin D. And between that demand and, of course, the problem that ultraviolet light is ultimately damaging to genetic material. So there's this balance going on. And a lot of how that balance works out depends on where your ancestors originated on the face of the earth. So if, as in my case, your ancestors came from northern climates, such as Ireland, in my case, then the scale is pushed more into more exposure. So I have light skin. I'm very sensitive to sunlight. I don't tan very well. I easily burn. As opposed to people whose ancestors came from closer to the equator, where in that situation, they had to push the scales more in towards the protection side of things because they were under a very intense light from the sun. And so there's this balancing act. And then there's a third component to all of this is what your diet is. So there are some people, for example, Eskimos, that their skin is darker than, say, my skin, that are living very close to the poles, at least the North Pole, and yet their skin is darker, and that's because their diet is rich in this vitamin D, and so their bodies can evolve to protect the genetic material more because they don't have to expose themselves so too much ultraviolet light. So it's very complicated, and there's lots of research around that, and your textbook addresses that a little bit too if you want to read more about that. So that's the synthesis of vitamin D. To carry that conversation forward a little bit, the skin also produces calcitrol, which is a hormone. And this is going to aid in the absorption of calcium in your diet. Okay. So calcitrol is a hormone, and so that makes the skin an endocrine gland. And one of the things that hopefully your instructor, when you get there for 40C, I believe it is, talks about is that our idea of what hormones are and how they behave and what structures are part of the endocrine system has really expanded as we begun to understand more clearly about how the body operates and the very complex and rich chemicals and signaling proteins and chemicals that are being used in the body to change the behavior of cells. It's quite, and we're still learning quite a bit about that, so it's an ongoing process. So the skin then becomes a part of the endocrine system as a result of the production of calcitrol. Finally, your textbook mentions absorption, and let me just write the word down. And I want to just say something about that. So, in my view of how the body works, it is true that you can absorb things across the skin. In fact, there are some medicines that are specifically designed to be placed on your skin so that your body absorbs them. Patches, so for nicotine patches, for example, and there's a variety of others. So that's something that really does happen. However, it's not something that is really a natural part of our environment. These are chemicals, these are technologies that we have invented as humans and applied them to the nature of our skin. So we've taken advantage of how the skin is put together, how the skin operates, how it works, the physiology of the skin, and we've utilized these technologies to take advantage of that physiology. I don't see that as a real natural part of the function of skin. So I'm kind of ambivalent. I'm not going to even go there again, but I'm kind of on the fence about this. I don't really see this as a natural function of the skin, although obviously it's something that the skin can do, and we have taken advantage of that process. All right, enough said on that. Let's talk about hair, and then we'll finish off our discussion and look at some glands that are part of the skin. So the next discussion is going to be about hair. So let's just start fresh and talk about hair. So, and this is an organ of the skin. So it's considered to be an organ of the skin. And what is an organ again? Two or more types of tissues functioning together to perform a particular function. As when we take apart the hair and look at it, and we'll see it fits that description. So what is the function of hair? Why do we have hair? And in fact, why do we have less hair than other mammals? That's also a very interesting question, but let's first just address what this class is about. So one of the functions, obviously, I hope anyway, is protection. So hair provides protection, particularly on the scalp, from sun. And in some cases, it also can provide help in terms of a decrease in heat loss, although that function is a lot less important in us as a species than other mammals because we've lost so much of our hair. But protection also can involve things like the eyebrows and the eyelashes. And these are also protective in nature. Now the eyebrows, not so much debris and things protecting the eye, but directing water away from the eye. So as we sweat, and we do produce a lot of sweat on our face and our head, as that sweat is being produced, it's dripping down our face, and the eyebrows tend to direct it away from the eyes. This would be important, particularly if you're hunting out in warm weather. You don't want water in your eyes. Is it absolutely perfect as a system? No. Anybody who's exercised knows that you still can be bothered by sweat coming into your eyes, but it would be a much more difficult problem were it not for eyebrows. The eyelashes, on the other hand, indeed are there to protect the eye from debris, dust, what have you. They're also serving as an early warning system because they're sticking out in front of the eye and they are connected to the nervous system. They're very sensitive. It's very difficult to touch the eyelashes without also closing your eyes. And that's a natural reaction, a natural reaction to touch that's important for protecting the eyes. Okay? But in addition to that, we have nostril hairs and also hair in the ear. So nostril hair and hair in the ear. Should have put hair first, but I didn't. And for the nostril hair, that's more of a filtering mechanism. So the complex sort of forest of hairs that we have inside the nose, and the stuff that sticks out of the nose that is so embarrassing and you generally tend to clip and get rid of, is just a small proportion of the actual hair. If you actually look up into the nose, you'll find there's a whole jungle of hair in there. And that hair contains on it mucus. So we've got this this network of hair. So as the air comes into our nostrils, it has to pass across or through this network of hairs, all of which contain this sticky substance, mucus, and so it acts as a filtering mechanism for the air that enters into our body. The hair in the ears is a little bit different. As far as we can tell, that's there to prevent insects from getting into our ears. Which seems kind of silly if you're living here, particularly in California. On the East Coast might be a slightly different idea, but we were not always living as we are today, protected in homes. So when we were out there closer to nature, that actually had some advantage, keeping insects out of our ear. So protection is certainly one of the functions of hair. But the other is sensation. So the ability to experience the sensation of touch. So touch receptors are associated with hair. So there's a tactile function to hair in addition to the things we've just talked about in terms of protection. So why are we less hairy than other mammals? We really don't know the answer to that question. We have some very, I think anyway, some very good hypotheses. And the most compelling hypotheses that I have heard is that we lost the hair and increased at the same time the number of sweat glands so that we could take advantage of sweat as a mechanism to cool our skin, to cool our body. If you are coated with a nice thick fur, it's very difficult for water to evaporate, and you lose the ability to take advantage of hair and the reduction of heat through evaporation. So if you lose your hair, increase the number of sweat glands. Now you have a system which is really good at controlling body temperature. Now, why would we want to do that? What is the advantage of making that kind of change? And this hypothesis argues that we were able to hunt in a different pattern than other mammals. We could hunt in the middle of the day. We could run long distances in the middle of the day without being affected by too much anyway by heat. And so the idea was that we could go out and look for animals that were resting in the middle of the day because it was hot. They have fur. They can't cool themselves efficiently. So they tend to be very quiet. They tend to seek shelter. They tend to seek shade. We would find these larger animals. We'd spook them, chase them. They would run for a distance. We would follow, track them, and then catch up with them. and cause them to run again, and this pattern would be repeated until finally the animal fell over with heat exhaustion, and we could close in and get our meal. So that's the hypothesis. There is quite a bit of supporting evidence for that. Is it the true story? I can't tell you. I don't really know, and I don't think anybody will come up with really a convincing all the facts. But I think it's pretty convincing hypothesis, though it is not a definite fact per se. All right. Anyway, so let's talk about hair. Let's talk about the structure of hair, and let's take a look at an image. And then you should have a drawing. It is available, and I'll show you what that looks like. Let's do that now. So if you don't have it, you can go get it. So you should have this drawing. We're going to use this drawing and fill in some information here on this drawing. So if you don't have it, now's a good time to put this on hold and go back to Canvas and download this, and then bring it back, turn this on, because we're going to be using this drawing to identify the various structures that the hair is composed of. Okay, so let's first look at the artist, the textbook picture image, and this is that same drawing in color. So first of all, let's just start right here and take a look at the emplacement of the hair. So most of the complex structure of the hair is found in the dermis, as you can see. So the so-called hair root and hair follicle, which is this area right down here, is found in the dermis. The hair itself extends through the epidermis and then pokes out through the surface. So that's called the hair shaft. And that you can see visibly above the surface of the hair. Now, if we take that and look a little bit more closely at the structure, what we're going to see, and we're taking a cross-section here, what we're going to see is a series of concentric circles composed of different types of cells and connective tissue. So the hair root, which consists of 3 concentric rings of material, the cuticle, the cortex, and the medulla. And then there is the hair follicle, which surrounds the hair root, and that is the internal root sheath and the external root sheath. And then surrounding all of that is this connective tissue sheath that is actually part of the dermis. So this is just the dermis arranged in a circle around the hair follicle and the hair root. So at this end, the hair enlarges, as you can see here, and there's this little indentation here. Let's go in close up to see that. Okay, and so this is the papillae of the hair, which is this nipple-like indentation. We see melanocytes that are scattered in the first layer here, which is called the matrix, and this matrix is going to produce these 3 concentric circles. So that is the cuticle of the hair, the cortex, and the medulla. Those 3 things, 1, 2, 3, are being produced by these set of cells right here. And in addition to that, the internal root sheath is also being produced by that structure. So 1, 2, 3, 4 areas. 1, 2, 3, 4. All of these are the production of this single layer of cells that are called the matrix. And then the other layers, the external root sheath, is produced by connective tissue. We'll talk about that. And then the outermost layer, which is the connective tissue, is just simply the dermis surrounding all of that. We also see a set of blood vessels, of course. We need those to nourish these cells. So these are mitotically active cells, and there will be cell division. They'll push upwards to create what we think of as the hair. So that's the basic structure. In addition to that, we also have smooth muscle attached to the hair and to the bulb of the hair. And so when this muscle contracts, it's going to literally move the hair in this direction. So the hair shaft moves in this direction. As I pull this way, the top of the hair is moving in that way. And when I do that, the skin at this side of the hair shaft is pushed back and out of the way, and it creates a little bump. So when I pull on this, and this hair moves from not straight up, it's at an angle, but when it moves up like that, stands on end, as we say, then that forces the hair here, or the skin, the epidermis here, to create a little ridge, and we call that what do we call that? Cheerios. My brain just went on vacation. Goosebump, thank you. That's just the ridge that's created as the hair pushes the epidermis out of the way in order for it to stand straight up. Why does the hair do that? What's going on? Why do we have muscles attached to our hair? Why would we want to move our hair? Well, at this point in our evolution, there is no real reason to have that. It doesn't serve any purpose for us. It's left over from our evolutionary past. It's not something that serves us. We don't get any kind of advantage out of the hair moving on end and standing on end. If we had fur, though, that would be an advantage for two real good reasons. First of all, if we were cold, we could take the hair, move it in a more perpendicular direction, and create a larger insulating layer of fur above our skin, and that would help us to keep warm. The other advantage is if we felt threatened, we could do the same thing, and we could create a larger body. We could so-called threat displays. You notice that a dog, its hair will stand on end on its back, and that's just to increase its size. Cats do the same thing. You may have noticed that when they're fighting, their hair, they fluff up their hair. And so there's two good advantages if you have a lot of hair for doing that, but for us, it doesn't. And it's interesting, though, when we get scared or we feel something is weird going on, our hair does stand on end because this muscle is being activated by the so-called sympathetic autonomic nervous system. That is our fight or flight system. And so one of the connections that system has is to these muscles. We activate those muscles, and our hair stands on end. And that should be, actually, you should pay attention to that if something's happening. Something, you may not be conscious of it, but your brain is. Something's not right, and it sets off an alarm bell. And don't ignore that. You should actually pay attention to that and investigate. Of course, it can be a false alarm, especially if you're sitting at home. You can start to imagine anything if you're home alone at night. But it is something that your brain is telling you, hey, things are not right here. Pay attention. So anyway, let's move on and describe the actual structures. We'll come back to this image. So you should have, and let's see, what's the best way to do this? Why don't I just do this? Why don't we get some information down into our notes, and then we'll come back to the drawing and indicate those areas in the drawing. And so we'll build the drawing or build on the drawing slowly as we put the information into our notes. So we're going to look at now the anatomy of hair. Okay. And so it is composed of dead, keratinized cells, okay, that are welded together. Okay. We have a number of structures. So the shaft, and there's an F there, let's do that, T. The shaft is the superficial portion. In other words, it's the part that sticks above the hair. So let's go ahead and identify that in our drawing. Okay. So if you get your drawing out, And let's just I'm going to kind of reinforce this. So, okay, so a little darker line there. And what we're talking about in terms of the shaft then, we draw a line here and here. This portion that's sitting above the surface of the air is the shaft. Okay. So that's our shaft. So as we just saw, this projects from the surface of the skin. Okay. Now that shaft in cross section can have different cross sections. If the shaft is round or close to round, your hair tends to be straight. On the other hand, if it has an oval type cross section, you tend to have wavy hair. And if it really becomes more or less kidney shaped, then you have very wavy hair. So it's a continuum, and that whether your hair is straight or has some curl to it, waves to it, depends on the cross section of the shaft of the hair. Okay. The root is deep to the surface. Okay. And extends into the dermis. Okay. Sometimes actually goes into the subcutaneous layer. All right, so let's get that into our drawing. So we talked about the shaft. Now we're going to look at the root. And so we can say from here to here, starting from the surface of the epidermis all the way down into the dermis, what we have here is the hair root. Okay. Okay. At the end, so the bulb of the hair, let's get that. The hair bulb is the enlarged end of the root. Okay. And it contains the matrix and the hair and the papillae of the hair. Which we'll talk about in just a bit. So let's go ahead and identify that in our drawing. So it's the hair bulb is the enlarged end of the root. It contains the papillae of the hair and the matrix. And let's go ahead, and I think we're just going to use, perhaps yellow would be a good choice of color. So this is, I'm going to just fill that in there. That enlarged area then is going to be the and that is the bulb of the hair. Okay. And if you look closely at the drawing, you might notice that there is some nerves. And we're going to use, let's a slightly darker, I think, perhaps. Let's see if, no, that's not good. Let me see if I have a darker pen here. Yeah, let's let's do this. Let's see if this works. If you look closely, there's some nerves here. Okay. And those are called the hair root plexus. Plexus, the hair root plexus. Okay. So let's add that to our list. So we have the hair bulb, and then we have the hair root plexus. And now the hair root plexus is a network of nerves that allow the hair to, that are sensitive to hair movement and touch. Okay. All right. So those are the main structures. Let's take a look at the shaft. So we're going to see how the shaft is composed of 3 concentric layers of tissue, or I don't want to say cells, not so much tissue, of cells. Okay. And we'll just list them and then we'll describe. So number 1, and this would be on the outside, so most superficial, is called the cuticle. And then in the center, the middle, is the cortex. And the third and deepest layer is the medulla. Okay. So let's go ahead and take our drawing and identify those 3. And let's see, let's do make some good choices here with color. So the center one, and then let's go ahead. Yellow is always a good choice. And there it is. Okay. And then we have one more. Let's go ahead and do orange. Okay, so those are our 3 right there. And let's go ahead and just label this. So this is going to be the hair roots. So as to not confuse anybody, I want to make sure the shaft is the superficial part. When it gets down here, it's called the root, but what we're talking about is the actual hair itself. So how are we going to identify these 3 layers? Let's see, the textbook simply calls them the hair root, as you can see, the hair root. So why don't we just be consistent with the textbook? Just be aware that that includes what we're also identifying as the shaft. Okay, so let's just lay that out there. So we're talking about the hair root, and we have the outer layer, and that's our cuticle. Okay. We have the next layer in yellow, which is the cortex. And then here, that is the center part is the medulla. Okay. All right, let's fill in some information then. In fact, why don't we do this? This will really, if you're looking at the drawing later after you've listened to the lecture, this might help you to interpret your drawing. So the shaft and root consist of one, the medulla, number two, the cortex, and number three, the cuticle. And that should take care of any confusion that you might have in the future. Okay? Okay, let's continue and let's fill in some information about each of those three layers that we've just identified. So, the cuticle is a single layer of flat, dead cells. These are heavily keratinized. And they lay on or their arrangement is like shingles on a house. So, in other words, what we're looking at is this kind of arrangement. Okay, they're overlapping. And in fact, we can see that pattern right here in this drawing. So, shingles, right, overlapping. So that's your cuticle. The cortex is the major part of the shaft. And it's composed of elongated cells. And these contain pigments. And if you have large amounts of pigment, then you have dark hair. If you have just small amounts, you have gray hair. If you have no pigments, then you have white hair. Finally, the innermost, the medulla. And this is composed of 2 to 3 rows of cells. These cells are polyhedral in shape. And they also contain pigments. Okay. All right. Surrounding these three layers is the hair follicle. So the hair follicle surrounds the hair shaft, and it's 3 layers of cells. Okay. All right. It is composed of, number Number one, we're going to list them, and then we will point them out in the drawing, and then we'll describe them. Okay. The external root sheath, and number two, the internal root sheath. Okay. So let's return to our drawing and identify those two layers. Okay, let's return to our drawing and pick out those two layers. So here's our drawing. And, well, we have a choice to make. And let's go with green. I'm going to go with green. And with blue. Okay. So I'm going to do this layer blue. And then the outer root sheath, I'm going to do in green. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead now and identify those. So this is going to be the hair follicle. And yeah, let's do that up here. The hair follicle. And that is composed of the external root sheath and the internal root sheath. Okay. And finally, let's go ahead and do the very last one. And I think I'm just going to go with pink on this. That layer right there. Might as well go ahead and identify what that is. And that is the dermal root sheath. And as the name implies, that is coming from the dermis. So this is part of the dermis. Okay. So let's go ahead and fill in the information for the external and internal root sheath. What are they? How do they come to be? Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I don't want to get into that too much. All right. So, the external root sheath. Okay. The external root sheath is a downward extension of the epidermis. And at the base of the hair follicle, it is a single layer, one layer of cells. And that layer should not surprise you, is going to be the stratum basale. And we know about the stratum basale. That's the layer that is mitotically active and is producing all the cells above. So this is going to be the matrix. That's going to be the matrix. So I'm going to try to do justice to this. So if this is the epidermis, and as we dive down, that epidermis is going to dive down with the hair shaft, but it's going to get smaller and smaller until finally it's just a single layer of cells. And so what you see here there we go. So this is my shaft, and the thickness of the dermis is normal here on the surface, but as it dives down, it just starts, layers of cells just start dropping off, and slowly until we finally get to a single layer of cells here, which is going to produce our matrix. And that's about the best I'm going to do to kind of visualize that for you. So it's just going to get thinner and thinner and thinner as it moves down closer to the base of the hair, until finally the last layer, the only layer that's left, is the stratum basale, and all the other layers have stopped, have disappeared. And so that's basically how this external root sheath works. Okay. The internal root sheath is produced. The internal root sheath is produced by what is called the matrix. We're going to do a close-up picture of that in just a second. Okay. All right. Let's see. Let's add some information to your drawing to help you with this information that we've just put into our notes. So down here at the bottom here, I'm going to write number 1, external root sheath is a extension of the epidermis. So it's actually the epidermis as it moves down along this the shaft of the cell to the very bottom. And the second one, the internal root sheath, is produced by the matrix. Okay. Oakley dokleys. All right, so let's do a close-up of that base area. And so what we're going to look like, or what we're going to do this kind of thing here. Okay. All right. And let's go ahead, and we're going to, at this point, we have the single layer of cells. And then we have okay. So let's go ahead and yellow indicate that this is going to be our matrix. Okay. So this is the matrix. Okay. All right. And then these are our melanocytes. Okay. And then, of course, we have blood vessels. Let's bring those in. We have our blood vessels. Okay. And let's fill in this space with little bit of pink here, so let's fill in this space here with some pink. Okay. And that's going to be our areolar connective tissue. All right, so what we've drawn here is the papillae of the hair. And it consists of these structures. And this, if we want to get a lot of details, this is a single layer of cells, and that's the stratum basale that we talked about, okay? I'm getting way into this too much. Okay. All right, let's get that into our notes. So this is going to be at the base of the bulb of the hair. We find the papillae of the hair, and that is composed of number one, areolar connective tissue, number two, blood vessels, number three, the matrix, which is the germinal layer of the hair. Okay. And this gives rise to the three structures that we described as being part of the hair, which is the cuticle, the cortex, the medulla, and the internal root sheath. Okay. Associated with the hair are some structures. Number one, sebaceous glands. And these are oil glands. Okay. Number two, smooth muscle. And this is, they're called the erector pili muscles. Okay. And they produce the goosebumps. I don't know why they're called goosebumps, but they are. So a quick drawing that might help us visualize what's happening here. So normally the hair shaft is going to be lying at some angle. Okay. And then we have this muscle that's attached here. And when that muscle is activated, this hair is going to move in this direction. And so we get this kind of thing happening. We get that hair standing on end. And as it stands on end, it creates this, which is the goosebump. Okay. All right, what else? That's it. We're going to add one other thing. We did already. We talked about the hair root plexus. Let's repeat that just for good measure. So, again, associated with the hair. So this is 1, 2, 3, I believe, is the hair root plexus. Okay. And these are nerves. And this gives us sensation of touch associated with the hair, of course. Okay. All right. We're almost done here, folks. So let's just finish up with the glands of the hair. Or glands of the skin, I should say, not the hair. It's glands of the skin. There are 4 glands. Some we're going to talk about in some detail. Others I'll leave to another class. So we'll list them and then we'll talk about them. Number 1, sebaceous glands. Okay. These are oil glands. Number 2, sudoriferous glands. These are sweat glands. Okay. Number 3, cereminous glands. And this is earwax. And number 4, mammary glands. And these produce milk. Okay. So the 2 glands I'm going to spend some time talking about are the first 2, sebaceous glands and sudoriferous glands. We don't really have too much to say about cereminous glands. It's earwax. I will tell you that your earwax is unique to you. That is, the composition of your earwax is unique to you. You can actually identify individuals by their earwax. So if you commit a crime, don't leave your earwax behind. And mammary glands, hopefully you will cover those in the last section or the last in 40C, the last course in this series. Well, let's begin with the sebaceous glands. Okay. These are typically connected to hair follicles. Okay. And the gland is found within the dermis. Okay. And the duct opens onto the neck of the hair, which is the portion of the hair just prior to it surfacing on or through the top of the layer of the skin. Okay. They are also sometimes on skin surface. That is, they open up to the skin surface on places like the lips, the glans penis, which is the head of the penis, the labia minora, which is the inner fold of the external genitalia for females, and the eyelids. So there, these glands, these oil glands, are actually emptying onto the surface of the skin rather than onto a hair shaft itself. Okay. Lips don't have hair. Glans penis doesn't have hair. Labia minora doesn't have hair, and the eyelids have the have on the inner surface of the eyelids. Certainly, they don't have hair. They have the eyelashes, but That's just one very specific area. Okay. They are absent on the palms and the soles of your feet. So you really want oily substance there, harder to grip. They will vary in size. Okay. And they produce an oil which is called sebum. Okay. And this consists of fats, cholesterol, proteins, mixture of organic substances, and inorganic salts. And you know what the definition of an inorganic salt is. Okay. Its functions, that is the function of the oil, is to prevent hair drying, and also excessive evaporation. Okay. So it's acting as a waterproofing in some ways. It also keeps the skin soft and pliable. And also, interestingly, inhibits certain bacteria. So it's acting to help protect yourself from bacteria. Not all bacteria, certain bacteria. Okay. The sudoriferous glands we have a lot of those, 3 to 4 million. And they're concentrated on the head in particular. It's not that they don't exist in high concentrations in other areas, but the head is particularly has a particularly dense number of sweat glands. That is because of this huge computer that we have inside our skull. It has to be kept warm, kept cool, I should say. There are 2 types of sweat glands. 2 types of sweat glands. Eccrine is the first type. Eccrine. And this is the most common. And it's found throughout the skin. Except in the following locations: the margins of lips, nail beds, glans penis, the glans clitoris, the labia minora, and the eardrums. They can have very high density. So 450 per square centimeter. That's pretty dense. So that would be, translate that about 3,000 per square inch. Squared inch, squared inch squared. Okay. All right. That's the eccrine gland. The second type of gland is apocrine gland. And this is mainly in the skin of, and we'll make a list here. I want you to pay attention to this list and tell me something. Number 1, pubic region. The areolar. Not areolar. Oh God, I want you to start that. Areola. Yeah, got it. Which is the dark patch around the nipple. Okay. Where else? And on the face, where we have the beard grows. Or hairs that make the beard grow. So mainly in the pubic region, the area and dark patch around this nipple, on the breast, on the face, where they, and also the armpits. So what's common to all those things? All those things are going to, except with the areola, all of those things are going to have hair when you enter into puberty. So they are changing. And so let me finish the information and I'll put that together in some coherent way. So these become functional. At puberty. And all these areas that we just mentioned are areas that start to grow hair during puberty, except for the areola. The areola. So what's happening here is that the sweat that's produced from this gland is slightly different. It's more viscous. It smells a bit more than sweat from the other gland, the eccrine gland. And it has some pheromone qualities to it. So it is connected to our sexuality and the ability to reproduce. So what is sweat? What is sweat? Sweat is a mixture of a number of different things. Primarily, obviously, water. But we also have ions. You have urea, which is a waste product. You have uric acid, also a waste product. We have amino acids. We have ammonia. We have glucose. We have a lot of organic compounds. Lactic acid. So many organic compounds are found in sweat. Finally, mammary glands. And these are modified sudoriferous glands. Interesting. And obviously they produce milk. Okay. And the last type of gland is the cereminous gland. It's an E. And this is also a modified sweat gland. Okay. And it produces earwax. Okay. The earwax has been found to have some anti-insect repellent qualities to it. So, again, this is trying to protect ourselves from the invasion of insects into our ears. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that finishes off this chapter on the integumentary system. And we will continue our story. And I believe the next chapter we're going to tackle is bone tissue. And then we'll finish off with muscle tissue. So we're getting close to the end here, folks. And I'll see you in the next lecture.